I believe that ideas and creativity are the lifeblood of communities, indeed societies. And for the last 20 years, I have practiced how to gather information to inform and to evaluate media and communications interventions designed to bring about social change, particularly in the international development sector. This has included multimedia campaigns, short and long format programming, radio and television dramas, all designed to shift levels of knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and social norms around a range of issues, from gender, human rights, health, governance, and education. And I use the term practice very deliberately because I often find myself drawing on theories and methods that were derived in Judeo-Christian cultures and applying them in contexts that are very, very different. I've conducted this work from Papua New Guinea to Pakistan, from Malawi to Myanmar. And this evening, as we imagine the next century, I invite you to reflect on three considerations about a culture and a society where ideas and creativity are nurtured. The three ideas are, first of all, the value of insight. Secondly, innovation and the folly of silos. And thirdly, assumptions about how change happens. In each case, I will draw on the work of people that I've learned from. I will give examples of how I'm applying those considerations in my own work, and then finally pose a number of questions for the next century. In 1980, Nuala Whelan was one of the first professors at DCU. And I learned a lot from Nuala. Nuala was a writer, a teacher, a TV producer, and is perhaps best well known internationally for her memoirs, Are You Somebody? And I remember very distinctly in one of her classes, Nuala introduced an image of a Victorian woman sitting in a window reading a book. And she challenged the class to express their assumptions about who the woman was, about gender, about social class, about privilege, about work, and about leisure. And she reminded us of how so much of our world and our worldview is socially constructed, and about the plethora of assumptions that we make about other people and the content that they're interested in. And I also remember a number of years later, working with senior executive producers at commercial television networks in the US, and as well as public television and at the BBC, where they pontificated about what audiences needed to hear. But Nuala sensitized me not to make those assumptions, not to make judgments about what other people needed to see or hear, particularly when I had an influence over the content that was being created. A number of years ago, I conducted a study in rural Afghanistan. And the study was focused on non-literate rural women, with the intention of encouraging these women, through radio programs, to register in the elections and to vote in the elections. We conducted our research, we did our due diligence, and subsequently, after the elections, we went back and we spoke to those women again. And yes, indeed, they had registered in the elections, and yes, they had voted. But there was little evidence of any knowledge or understanding that the decision they made would impact a decision in Kabul to select a man who would make policy decisions to affect their lives. I had made significant assumptions about those women, and I was wrong. And that mistake clearly impacted the success of our program. And so I suggest two questions for us in terms of the next century and in terms of insight, is first of all, what cultural mechanisms will we have in place for individual and collective reflection? And secondly, how will we influence the content that's produced in our name for us beyond our ability to consume? A number of years later, I also worked with Everett Rogers, fondly known as Ev. And Everett Rogers is known in the innovation and social marketing sector as the author of a classic text on the diffusion of innovation. And the diffusion of innovation is an attempt to explain how and why and at what rate new ideas and technologies are adopted. A key concept in the diffusion of innovations literature is the notion of homophily. And homophily is the predisposition for us to surround ourselves with people like us, people who have similar demographic characteristics, similar age, similar sex, similar gender, and also similar psychographic characteristics, so similar attitudes and similar values. And what Ev's work has uncovered is that homophilous situations lend themselves very well to the diffusion of innovations. They do not, however, lend themselves very well to new ideas. Why? Because there's very little exchange of new information, because we all think very similarly. I'm currently working in South Sudan with the World Food Programme, and the objective of the project is to develop what's referred to as a complaints and feedback mechanism, whereby beneficiaries, that is, people who get food or food vouchers from the World Food Programme, can actually express their feedback and complaints about how that process works. And in our due diligence and our research, in the first stage or first phase of consultation, we uncovered very, very little in terms of expectations and perspectives on this potential mechanism. It was only when we diversified our research base and spoke to a much broader range of people that we began to see that there was a much broader range of expectations and perspectives. And so Ev Rogers' idea of heterophily, introducing a broader range of perspectives and ideas and expectations into the process, meant that we had a much more creative, innovative, new idea and mechanism for the World Food Programme. What does this mean for the next century? Well, first of all, in the current global political climate and the increasing intolerance of difference, the question for us is, how do we maintain a perspective on difference as positive? And secondly, how do we avoid what I'm referring to as the folly of silos, and rather embrace an interdisciplinary way of thinking at the forefront? Within the social sciences, there is a particular focus in terms of media and social change on what's commonly referred to as media effects. It's very much a top-down perspective in terms of how does media change society? How does it change society in terms of violence, in terms of sexuality, in terms of stereotyping? I was very fortunate to work with a media sociologist, Sandra Ball, whose perspective on the relationship between media and citizens was slightly different. Sandra's perspective was to focus not on the media, but on citizens, on individuals, and to really understand not what the media does to people, but how people use the media. And that was her frame of reference, was citizens and citizen engagement. Within the international development sector, training journalists is a very, very common practice, particularly in developing countries and fragile and conflict-affected states. And the purpose of training journalists is typically to increase the amount and quality of coverage in mainstream and community media, with the ultimate intention of holding governments to account and making governmental processes much more transparent. But from a research perspective, the key challenge for me and the teams I work with is to actually substantiate that these training programs have made a difference, right? To actually present evidence of a return on investment. And a key metric for us in that is actually looking at citizen engagement, the extent to which citizens have engaged with that content and made decisions about their own lives as a result. What does this mean for the next century? Well, first of all, what political efficacy can citizens expect in Ireland in the future? And under what conditions is that likely to happen? And then secondly, what are the ways in which that political efficacy can actually be exercised, particularly in the context of schools and training young people to be able to exercise that political efficacy more broadly. As a preface to my final remarks, I want to challenge us to think not so much about the question that was posed tonight, to imagine the next century, but actually to pose the question slightly differently and to say, how can I engage to mold what that next century looks like? That's a very different question because it shifts the focus back on us as individuals. It shifts us back into an active position rather than a passive position. And taking that responsibility opens up several opportunities. First of all, it gives us more control over the insights derived from the content that's produced for us, and also greater critical thinking skills to actually understand and interrogate those words and images that define us. Secondly, it allows us to appreciate other worldviews and other perspectives, not as superior or inferior, but rather as valuing difference as inherently positive. And then finally, it forces us to think about us as active agents in that process, rather than passive participants. So let us not view the next century without mechanisms for critical thinking and insight, without diversity within innovation, and without critical individual citizen engagement in social change. I thank you.